But sadly, we are becoming a society of single-parent households, and the effect it has had on our youth is catastrophic. For 2028, the National Parenting Support Commission, the NPSC, blames poor parenting for escalating crime and violence, which prompted Prime Minister Andrew Holness to declare a state of public emergency in St. James Parish. According to Keisha Kerr, CEO of the NPSC, poor parenting was the driver of crime down in St. James, so we had to respond. Mr. Moderator, this is not only an international and regional problem. We here are experiencing the effects of this epidemic here at home. In a BVI News article posted on February 12, 2018, then opposition leader and current premier, the Honorable Andrew Foy, commended local law enforcement for their tireless efforts in fighting crime, but noted, and I quote, "The fight against crime also rests with parents who must monitor their children and teach them good values." Our Honorable Premier recognizes where ultimate responsibility lies. He recognizes that the onus is on the parents to help combat this pervasive, encroaching criminal culture that threatens to tear our society apart from within. But teaching good values just isn't enough. Out of guilt for their shortcomings, our parents shower us with possessions and not positivity. They stuff our stockings with accessories, not attention. Possessions, not positivity. Dollars, and not discipline. The most well-intentioned parents encourage crime when they are neglectful of their children and ignorant of their activities. Mr. Moderator, esteemed judges, attentive audience, worthy opponents, the responsible parent is like the loving, attentive gardener who optimizes sunlight, nourishes with nutrients, prunes when necessary, and uses only the purest of water. The effort, the ultimate labor of love. Tragically, instead, we are seeing the stunted vegetation that grows wild in the absence of attention and affection. We see the thorn and the withered fruit, the bitter and dangerous product of indifference and neglect. I thank you.
Time, 7 minutes, 50 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Phipps. We now welcome the opposition's first speaker, Ms. Amalia Adamson. Give her a warm welcome.
The winners are those who learn to take full responsibility for their actions. The losers are those who blame others for their failures. Abdul Kalam, politician and 11th President of India. Let me be clear when I say, in the BVI, the crime rate is already relatively low. In fact, according to nationmaster.com, out of 203 countries, we are ranked 13th from the bottom. This would imply we have a low crime rate. However, we are cognizant that there are many reasons for crime in the VI, and that is why we oppose the move this evening. That criminal culture among young people is not a serious indictment of parenting in the Virgin Islands, and parents are not the most influential reasons that children commit crimes. Esteemed judges, Mr. Moderator, erudite audience, and formidable opponents, good evening. To facilitate this discourse, allow me to define the key terms of this move, according to Oxford Dictionary. Prevalence, to be widespread in a particular area. Criminal culture, a culture that facilitates illegal activity. Indictment, a formal change or accusation. Parenting, the activity of bringing up a child as a parent. Thus, the reworded use states that widespread illegal activity is a strong accusation against the BVI parents, as it would be easy to hold parents solely accountable for children's actions. They raised the children after all. However, let's look closer and explore the real reasons for criminality in our youth, because they are the victims of low priority, peer pressure, poverty, and social media. Opportunity and priority. Why is it that education is such a low priority for our government? What happens when students feel neglected in our educational systems? We all agree that education should be the most important issue in the country. After all, a country that lacks knowledge lacks power. In order to secure a thriving future for our territory's children, so that they don't fall prey to criminal culture, we must become high achievers in math, in reading, and in science. Unfortunately, the collective concern for education continues to wane. Not just in the BVI, but around the world. A recent study from independent.co.uk states, children with poor reading and math skills are increasingly likely to become hardened criminals as society becomes more complex. According to research that sheds light on the link between education and criminality, there is now a significant connection between low literacy and numeracy levels and repeat offending, particularly for men and younger people. If we don't provide opportunities, we limit our students' choices. The article continues to state that illiteracy and related education factors contributed to 13% of the chance of being arrested. End of quote. Teachers across the world, including this territory, continue to express their dissatisfaction with leadership, with salary, with lack of resources and infrastructure. Our children are in a crisis, and the future is in jeopardy, and we become more and more vulnerable to the darkness of ignorance and unawareness. We lack the opportunities and priorities in education, and this is one reason that there is such a prevalent criminal culture among young people. Just yesterday, my colleagues and I attended the first sitting of the 4th House of Assembly, and our Honorable Premier, Mr. Foy, insisted that parents cannot be entirely scorned for their children's behavior, because we don't have the opportunities and educational programs. Our government is currently working on these new programs, because even the government is convinced that parents are not entirely to blame. As a community, we must resolve to offer more programs, to provide adequate resources and prioritizing funding, as well as to be positive role models. After the ceremony, it was mentioned that the students are not knowledgeable enough to know about right and wrong, and will end up feeling ostracized, wanting attention, and spiral out of control. This is not fair on the children, not the teachers, nor the public. And something must be done to increase the importance of education. The parents are not at fault for a criminal culture amongst youths of the Virgin Islands. It is the lack of opportunities and prioritization within our educational system. Mr. Moderator, everyone in this room has experienced peer pressure. It occurs in all schools across the world. And the consequences of peer pressure is wide-reaching. Stacey Ziegler, a mentor and teacher, illustrates the association of peer groups as an agent of socialization determines to a large extent the social codes an individual learns. Ms. Ziegler also found that when children start school, their parents begin to lose the influence they once had. By the teenage years, Peers are the most influential group as teenagers navigate finding an identity and figuring out the roles that they play. Unfortunately, teenagers who choose the wrong peer groups can find themselves getting into a lot of trouble. End of quote. Adolescents are far more likely to commit a violent act if their friend has already done so. And researchers have found that a teen's environment exerts extreme influence. They see what their peers are doing, and they decide what is socially acceptable or even expected, and then they model their own behavior to fit. Their environment molds them into people their parents may not even recognize. Ultimately, the decision is the child's choice, with the great influence from their friends. As Albert Einstein has said, the level of consciousness that made the problem. To conclude, the prevalence of a criminal culture among young people is not a serious indictment of parenting in the Virgin Islands. Of course, we are not saying that parents have nothing to do with the young people turning to criminality. But what we are saying is anyone who is really invested and interested in this matter should seek to get to the roots of the problem. In recent times, our government has not prioritized education and has not provided sufficient opportunities for youth to be gainfully occupied outside of school hours. Additionally, young people are much more influenced by their peers and their parents, and they fall prey to negative peer pressure. The criminal culture has sucked in our peers. This blight on our lovely British Virgin Islands is a serious indictment of the BVI government and community. We thank you.
Time, 8 minutes, 27 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Phipps. Now please give a warm welcome for the proposition's second speaker, Ms. Jefferina Morrison.
Testing. I recognize the established protocol. Good evening, everyone. It is my job to support what the first speaker has so eloquently commenced and enlighten you on why the prevalence of a criminal culture among young people is a serious indictment of parenting in the Virgin Islands. Mr. Moderator, everyone we contacted, from the magistrate to social development to law enforcement professionals, were all unanimous in their observation that the single greatest reason for this predicament is the lack of effective parenting. But the clock is ticking, not only on our opportunity to deal with this gathering storm that threatens to derail the remarkable progress we have experienced as a territory. Truancy Officer Mr. Dixon Igwe states passionately, and I quote, "Poor parenting is the primary factor leading to crime as it drives deviancy and truancy," end quote. Mr. Igwe revealed that their official records indicate that 90% of truants reside in single-parent households. Let that sink in for a second. The eminent local magistrate, Mrs. Ayana Baptiste Dabrio, weighs in on this critical issue. He laments, and I quote, "Poor parenting is one of the major contributing factors to the prevalence of criminal culture among our youth." Mrs. Baptiste Dabrio insists that a well-rounded person is created by a host of factors, but the primary foundation comes from the whole. Mr. Moderator, like our first speaker mentioned, sometimes trying to provide for their kids. The hard-working single mother who hustles between 2 or 3 jobs in a noble effort to keep her children sheltered, clothed, and fed is deserving of our admiration and support. But her unavailability causes a lack of supervision, a void that is quickly filled by negative influences. The inability to substantially supervise one's offspring is a characteristic of poor parenting, according to our Social Development Department. The probation office within that department is responsible for administering court-mandated parenting classes to the parents and guardians of youthful offenders. In fact, the problem is so acute that they can hardly keep up with the torrent of cases that they are required to handle. Statistics from the Royal Virgin Islands Police Force show an alarming rise in most crimes. The year 2017 saw a calamitous 10 murders, the highest in a decade. The vast majority of these crimes are perpetrated by our young people. Sadly, we've also seen in the past few years a precipitous rise in reported drug offenses, from a total of 49 in 2014 to an unnerving 98 cases by 2017. These crimes have doubled in 3 years. Sounds prevalent to me? Our criminal justice system plays a huge role in raising and disciplining our youth. Sometimes the best advice they ever get is from the magistrate during trial or from the probation officer during supervision. Mr. Moderator, esteemed judges, attentive audience, worthy opponents, we can blame materialism and consumer culture. We can blame social media and technology. But the foundation, the moral center of gravity instilled by competent and attentive parents prepares us to face any challenge. Thank you.
Time, 4 minutes, 57 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fitz. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome for the opposition's second speaker, Mr. Maury Glasgow.
Growing up wasn't easy. I had it kind of hard. 4 of us on one bed, and sometimes we'd starve. So many times we went to school penniless, no food, so I had to gamble inside the bathroom lunchtime just to make sure I feed my brother there. So many times we went to the grocery store with just 20 bucks, had a long list, couldn't afford everything, so we had to 5-finger discount stuff. By 5-finger discount, I mean thief. This is only a segment of the poem titled Looking Back, written by Jamari Hart, an inmate at the Her Majesty's Prison in Balsamgut. Mental health professionals have studied the lives of young criminals in a desperate quest to determine what went wrong during their upbringing. They realize that it is too easy and way too convenient to simply assume that mothers and fathers are at fault. Think about it. Can blaming parents really explain the phenomenon, or does it help complicate the chilling truth? Learned judges, Mr. Moderator, audience, and esteemed proposition, good evening. We assert that the prevalence of a criminal culture among young people is not a serious indictment of parenting in the Virgin Islands. We, along with scientists, researchers, educators, and those who work in the criminal justice system, assert that the criminal culture among our young people is a serious indictment of us, the BVI government, and our societies both locally and internationally. My colleague has established that the criminal culture among young people is indeed a serious indictment of low priority within the educational system and peer pressure. Firstly, extreme poverty anywhere is a threat to human security everywhere. Kofi Annan, 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. Mr. Moderator, poor parents are at times too poor to parent. According to research led by Oxford University, parents themselves are not the reason for an increase in problem behavior amongst young people. The blame must be laid squarely at the feet of a community that sees these parents, these families battling poverty and does nothing to alleviate their suffering. The desperation for necessities, like in Mr. Hart's poem, can lead to young people engaging in criminal activities such as theft and dealing with drugs just to provide for their family. How can you blame a mother who is working 2 jobs in order to keep food on the table for not being in the house and monitoring her children's activities? She has to make the hard choice between feeding her children or staying at home with them while they starve. Secondly, for better and for worse, social media has become a significant part of our everyday lives. The messages to youth from both regional and international media, and music in particular, are often expressions of rage. When Lil Pump raps, still flying dope in the jets, huh? It is clear our youth are being overpowered with negative influences that contribute to the criminal culture that entangles them. Being continually exposed to media that glorifies crime will result in behaviors where they would likely use crime to solve their problems. It is clear that this is an urgent call for us to make our young people a priority, counter negative peer pressure with positive role models, establish poverty alleviation programs, reduce negative social media influence, but create positive media content. Mr. Moderator, we have provided research findings, statistics, evidence, and logical reasoning, all providing undeniable evidence. My colleagues and I stand firm that the prevalence of a criminal culture among young people is not a serious indictment of parenting in the Virgin Islands. Thank you.
Time, 4 minutes, 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Fitz. We'll now have a 5 minutes of complete silence starting right now for the debaters to prepare their rebuttals. Thank you very much, Mr. Phipps. Please give a warm welcome for the opposition's rebuttal speaker, Caitlin Archibald Drew, to make his rebuttal.
Good evening, everybody. Mr. Moderator, esteemed judges, my worthy opponents, and our valued audience. The mood of today's discourse is that the prevalence of criminal culture among young people is a serious indictment of parenting in the Virgin Islands. I, with my colleagues, stand strongly in opposition of this moot. My opponents argue that the prevalence of single-family homes in the BVI is indicative of a breakdown in parenting that has led to a criminal culture in the BVI. Well, this is simply not true. 50 years ago, there were many single-parent homes and no criminal culture. So what changed? Well, the difference is that they had a better support network. They had the nanny net. The nanny net was a close-knit network of old ladies that would pass messages down the grapevine and discipline misbehaving children whenever they saw fit. If my grandmother was walking home from school and she did something wrong, you guys better believe that Miss Rhoda Hodge would know about it by the time she got home, and that Miss Rhoda Hodge would be waiting with a pot spoon to dole out some discipline. This problem is not due to the breakdown of the two-parent family, but due to the breakdown of our extended support network. Now, people simply don't care. They say, that child acting up over there, not my problem. That child's attitude, not my problem. We are supposed to be one BBI, not one BBI when it's convenient for us. This criminal culture isn't an indictment of parenting, but an indictment of the breakdown of our extended family ties. The proposition then argued that the hardworking single mother who is unavailable to her child due to work is a serious reason for our criminal culture in the BVI. But I don't think that's a reflection on that parent. I think it's a reflection on us. Why don't we as a society offer those parents a decent wage so they don't have to work around the clock to make ends meet, so they can spend time with their children? Lastly, my opponents argue that poor parenting in the BVI is the primary reason for a criminal culture. Now, let's put that in some more specific terms. Would any of the 6 of us up on this stage today tell our parents that they're doing a bad job of raising us? Would we even believe such a thing? No, we would not. Because we know that our parents are doing their very best. And other BVI parents are no different. They're doing their very best. What they have lost is community support, the support of the church, the support of their extended families. We've heard this old adage our whole life: it takes a village to raise a child. We have failed our youth. This is not an indictment of BVI parenting. This criminal culture is an indictment of BVI unity. Thank you.
Time, 3 minutes, 34 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the proposition rebuttal speaker, Mr. Brent Andrew, to make his rebuttal.
Testing. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I acknowledge the previously established protocol. It's been a great debate, But who's to blame? Society, God, young people, or those who raised them? The ones who've been with them from day one, literally. Aren't these the ones to be held responsible for molding their children like the potter molds clay? Now, to summarize quickly, our first and second speakers showed clearly the central role that bad parenting has on the prevalence of crime in our community. They cited information from local experts who are on the front lines and understand our issues best. Everyone from police officers to social development professionals, truancy experts, and learned magistrates agree wholeheartedly that poor parenting creates a prevalent criminal culture among our young people. My main role as rebuttal speaker is to challenge some of the claims put forth by our worthy opponents, and there's quite a bit that we disagree with. Mr. Moderator, our opponent stated that the children in this education system don't know right from wrong. But whose job would it be to teach these same young people right from wrong? Wouldn't that be the parents' job? They mentioned that peer pressure may be a reason. But if parents instill a strong moral compass within their kids, more than likely they won't succumb to something as minor as peer pressure. They also mentioned getting to the root of the problem. But I know that the word root means beginning. And if everything begins at home, then that would mean that parents are the problem. Ladies and gentlemen, they gave a scenario saying that if a mother has to go and work 2 jobs, how would she look after her children? Where's the father? That is exactly the problem. Where is the father within the home to look after the kids when the mother is going to work? Parenting. Parenting is the problem. My paper full. I'm very sorry. Mr. Moderator, our worthy opponents blame our educational system. Don't they recognize that our parents, as I said, are our first and most important teachers? Don't they realize that our homes are the first and most important schools? Blaming things such as music that glorifies crime shows exactly the problem with parents. Where is the parental advisory? Who is it that is going to tell these children, no, you should not be watching this, or no, you should not listen to this certain type of music? The parents. Those are the problems. In conclusion, I would like to thank you all. These debates would not be possible without you guys. I would like to especially thank our parents, whose vigilance, wisdom, and patience help us cope with the pressure and temptation. They inspire us. They are our first and most important role models, the cultivators of our character. Ladies and gentlemen, we rest our case.
Time, 3 minutes, 39 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stoutt. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. I can't decide who is correct. I mean, you know, I thought I had it all figured out, but now I'm totally confused. So, when I look at your faces, I'm sure that you're having some challenges as well, because it has been 2 really well-presented arguments. So give them a round of applause. While the judges are deliberating, I'd first like to ask our new minister for education, culture, youth affairs and sports, agriculture, and fisheries. You got broad shoulders, brother. Dr. the Honorable Natalia Shawande Uhuru Wiki to give us a brief address, after which we'll have our impromptu speeches.
Good evening to you all. Firstly, let's give the debaters another round of applause. They did a fantastic job. I think if they were a little older, I may not be in this position where I am now if I had to debate against that type of talent. Give yourselves a round of applause for being an excellent audience and coming to support our young persons who have such a marvelous talent. Let me just speak a little bit about debates and the importance of debates. You know, this is an activity that I'm very pleased with. I'm very much in support of. In fact, I've judged debates before, and I do not envy the position that the judges are in right now, because this was a really hard-fought debate, and it's not much separating both teams at all. But I've been involved in debates. I've also been on the radio with my good friend Edjuenka, and we have debated issues. Debate is an important part of the democratic process, and we need much more debate in our societies, as opposed to what can happen sometimes where we teach our young persons simply to listen to the opinions of those in authority and just internalize whatever they've been told. And we must teach, especially in these modern times, teach our young persons skills. Teach them critical thinking skills. Teach them information literacy skills. You know, teach them all other skills, how to agree to disagree, you know, how to deal with conflict. These are all types of skills that are very important to be able to function effectively in today's society. And given, you know, the output I see here today, I would say that we're on the right track. We just need a little bit more support and to push it out a bit more. In terms of the moot itself, I'm with Edjuenka. I am totally confused now. After the first speaker on the proposition, I said, okay, I agree with that. Then I had the first speaker on the opposition, I said, no, I agree with that. Second speakers, rebuttals, you know, I'm completely confused now. But I think the reason why it's such a good debate is because there's truth in both positions. You know, I've seen situations where you had, let's say, a parent who English is not even their first language. Perhaps English is, they don't even speak English that well. They might be a Spanish speaker. And you see their child at the top of their class. You know, how do we explain that? You know, perhaps, you know, it's a very complicated situation. I've seen situations where you have persons who perform extremely well in the classroom and in society, and you see that their parents are well educated, their grandparents are well educated. You know, some persons might say the position I'm in would be because I have parents, or my grandfather was a former chief minister. And then you see situations where the environment that young persons have to deal with is very difficult, and it's very easy to see a connection between their behavior and their environment. Then you see another situation where persons overcome the adversity of their environment and end up doing fantastic things. Well, I really think the truth is that there's nothing really static in life, and there are always a multiplicity of factors that are constantly wrestling with each other to be able to come up with a result. And we can't come up with a formula to say, well, this will happen in this situation at this particular time. So it's a very complicated matter. Matters that, as Minister of Education, Culture, and all the rest, I have to deal with, and my colleagues have to deal with. But I think it's important for us as a society to have these discussions so that we can put measures in place to support parents, and also, because it doesn't have to be one or the other. We have to support parents and at the same time ensure that the environment, supports, the work of parents at home. So I'm looking forward to the conclusion, and I'm looking forward to the impromptu speeches. Thank you for allowing me a bit of your attention, and continue to support Education Week. And I want to say a special thank you to all the educators present, and all of the staff that support the work of education, and all the parents and the students for the work you're doing to build a successful education system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for those words of encouragement. Our impromptu speech. This is the fun part. Any members of the audience want to come up? All the old people want to come up? And no? Nobody? I know you. You put the scale. You can't. Okay, let me start. Impromptu speech guidelines. Each student will draw a topic from the envelope, and they have 1 minute to prepare, 1 minute of time to prepare, and 3 minutes to speak on the topic. This segment is judged independently from the debates. The criteria for the judging is audibility and clarity 10 points, articulation 10 points, voice modulation 10 points, organizational speech 15 points, content of the speech 15 points, persuasiveness 10 points, fluency 15 points, eye contact 5 points, body language 10 points, for a total of 100 points. Our impromptu speech adjudicators are Mr. Damian Grange. He is currently employed with the BVI Health Services Authority. He holds an executive diploma in management from the Chartered Management Institute, is a trained teacher, and an accomplished writer of poetry and plays. He is also a proud member of the Tortola Toastmasters and the Purple Dragon, Tortola Toastmasters Club and the Purple Dragon Karate School. Give a warm welcome. For my good community service brother, Damian Grange. Sister Kamika Fobbs is employed as a senior legal counsel and currently sits as the Assistant Registrar of Trademarks, Patents, and Copyright at the BVI Financial Services Commission. Kamika is a trained legal practitioner who was engaged in civil practice for the past 6 years. As a litigator, she is no stranger to healthy debate. She is also actively engaged in several community-based nonprofit organizations, including the BVI Frontal Project. Mrs. Fobbs is the chairman of the BVI Nonprofit Organization Registration Board and a member of the Planning Appeals Tribunal of the Government of the Virgin Islands. Give a warm round of applause for Ms. Kamika Fobbs. Now, let's get down to business. Down to business. From Brigada Flax Educational Center, Mr. Nicholas Kanai. Welcome.